TBA 2021 clinic called Broaden Your Pedagogical Path from Piccolo to Percussion. I'm Laura Bell.
And I'm Katie Lewis.
We're super excited to share with you today.
When we first got together and talked about what would we like to present on to the state of Texas, we first thought pedagogy. That is something that people don't always pay attention to because they're really focused on like classroom management or recruitment. And we thought it would be important for young teachers and even seasoned teachers to get a refresher and become more well-rounded students, to broaden their path of their pedagogy. Whenever I was in college, I certainly thought in my first job that I would come out and get to be the woodwind specialist for the campus because I'm a flute player. Lo and behold, I was asked to teach a trumpet class right away. Even in my second year, I had to teach a horn class. Because of that, that really caused my path to widen quickly because I had to learn how to teach all those different instruments.
My primary instrument is percussion. So I came out of college not really having a whole lot of knowledge about any of the wind instruments and was forced to learn very, very quickly. But to be honest, that has been such a benefit to me. And we want to share that same concept with you.
Pedagogy truly drives everything that you're doing particularly in your performing bands, because you have to quickly be able to diagnose things on the podium, give students quick feedback and quick tidbits of information. And today we're going to share some of those great things with you to help you learn and broaden your path as you go along.
Now, we are not deep diving into every single instrument, but our goal today is to give you the Cliff's Note version of quick things that you can say for every instrument. Let's go ahead and get started. Now, right now, while you have time this summer, before things get crazy, there are some things that you can do to help you be really effective from the podium. Number one, make sure that you know what your deficiencies are. And if you're not sure what they are, ask someone who has seen you teach. Ask someone who has been there with you so that they can help you. And then you can work to correct those deficiencies as quickly as possible. You need to know how to assemble, hold, and maintain every instrument.
Super critical.
Including percussion. You need to understand that. That is going to help you be able to diagnose things quickly, and that's going to be a huge time saver for you when you're in the middle of a rehearsal or a sectional. I cannot stress to you enough the importance of knowing your transpositions.
Yes.
They need to be committed to your memory. You need to be able to go from concert pitch to their pitch, and from their pitch to concert pitch like that. That is something that is simply just memorization. You just need to practice, make flashcards, anything you need to do to help you memorize those transpositions. Big time saver. Now, Katie and I strongly encourage you to pick up one new instrument every year, at least one. You can grab a beginner method book and work on a new instrument over winter break. You can do a couple of instruments over summer, do one over spring break. And before you know it, you have a lot more experience understanding what your students are going through. That's going to make a big impact on your ability to communicate effectively with your kids.
And it'll make you a better teacher in the long run.
Make a pact with yourself to play a new instrument with your students this year. If you lead teach a non-varsity band, maybe you sit in a sub-non-varsity band and play a secondary instrument right alongside the students. That's a great way for, again, you to get a feel for the instrument and understand what your students are experiencing.
And your students will have a lot of respect for you because you're putting yourself out there to play your non-primary instrument, and they will love it. So we encourage you to do that. Speaking of your rehearsals, you need to plan your rehearsals according to your students' needs. That's really important because you need to look at not just the score for pieces that you're going to teach them, but the individual parts as well. That is critical because you can see what the students are going to see. You can, as their teacher, foresee the issues and the technical things that they're going to have to go through, whether it's knowing all the terms that are on their paper so that you can teach those to them, whether it's knowing if there's a specific measure that's going to have a special fingering or a special ornamentation or trill. You've got to check that stuff out ahead of time so that you can be the most effective teacher and being totally ready to go on all of your pedagogy.
We're going to talk to you about every instrument in the ensemble right now and some of the most common concerns with young musicians or young players. Now, we've tried to fit these concerns or these issues into these three big categories of tone, tuning, and technique. Not all of these things fit nicely into one of those categories, so bear with us there. But let's dive right in and get started with piccolo.
Our first instrument is the piccolo and the flute. The most important thing you can teach your students when you're in a full band rehearsal or a sectional setting is to remember to bunny down. That means to take their top lip and bring it down more towards the lip plate. That will affect their air direction and quickly fix things that you're going to most commonly hear in a full band setting. This will help your flute players not sound as airy and also be more in tune, particularly in the upper register. So that's a quick go-to that I say to my flute players all the time. And it's even more so on the piccolo. Keep remembering that flute players should also keep their corners in and not smile or bring their corners back when they play. And if you see that, you can address that quickly, corners in. The most out of tune notes on the flute are C, C sharp, and F. And you can adjust those notes by adding fingers. And that's a quick thing that you can take care of in rehearsal as well. We will provide those alternate fingerings in our handout and also in our Google Drive of resources. When you're adjusting tuning for flutes, you always want to make sure that you don't ask them to pull out or push in all the time. You're just going to try to keep it a little bit further out at times.
What I try to do with my flutes is when we set up the flute head joint, we tell them I only want about the width of a nickel of the darker metal showing. That is where they should set up on a regular basis, and then we adjust everything else here.
With the embouchure, absolutely. And keep in mind, overblowing is what causes that airiness in sound and the sharpness in the upper register. So you want to teach students the right way by controlling their aperture size and their bunny muscle to make those higher notes come out perfectly. There are three types of B flat on the flute, and that's really important to know. The most common and the one you should be teaching the most is top thumb or double thumb on the flute.
And you guys, I didn't even know that double thumb B flat fingering existed until I had been teaching for 8 years.
So it's really important. And if you don't know about it, we're going to go into much more detail on it in our Google Drive of resources. So stay tuned to learn more about the three types of B flat. For oboe, the most important thing to remember when teaching tone from the podium or in your sectionals is to remember that their embouchure needs to be set up correctly, and you can easily see that from the podium. Make sure it looks like a drawstring embouchure with corners in, and everything is wrapped around the reed. Another way to say that quickly is milkshake, because you can tell them to think about sucking a milkshake out of a straw. If they look like they're eating a hamburger, that's the wrong embouchure. So you can even say not hamburger. Those are quick things to say. Make sure your oboe students are using their tuners daily. There's nothing more important than that, because the oboe can only be adjusted by the reed and not pushing the reed in and out. Middle C is the most out of tune note on oboe and is most frequently used for students in music, especially at the middle school level. You'll want to make sure to check out our resources for how to adjust that middle C. And for the high notes above the staff, keep teaching your oboe players not to bite. That will keep them better in tune for you and make sure that they seamlessly fit into your ensemble.
It's all about faster airspeed, more air pressure.
Absolutely. And on the three types of F on oboe, we have the right F, the left F, and the forked F. We want to make sure to know when to use them and how to use them, and that's important as well. Left E flat versus right E flat is important to know when you're teaching your technique to your students, particularly in sectionals. Another quick thing you can always keep an eye on during rehearsal is whether or not your oboe students are rolling their first finger or sliding for half whole notes. You want to make sure they never slide. So that's a quick thing you can say. No sliding, only rolling. That's a great thing that you can keep in mind for your technique. And quick shout out to the Vocal Majority Bootcamp book. They have the best fingering charts and the best resources for teaching the oboe and the bassoon.
For bassoon, it's very similar to oboe and most of the other wind instruments that we're talking about. You'll hear us say corners in a lot. You can have some really poor tone qualities, some thin tone qualities in bassoon if your bassoon players are pulling their corners back. That causes them to bite down on the reed and get a nasty thin sound. So corners in for that more rounded, full, beautiful bassoon tone quality. Now, for tuning and some alternate fingerings, we cannot speak highly enough about the Vocal Majority Bootcamp book and that fingering chart that's associated with that book. Some of the things that you see with these tuning issues and alternate fingerings, all those resources are there for you in that fingering chart. Make sure that your double reed players are using tuners daily. They need to be using them in your rehearsal, in section rehearsals, and in their individual practice. One of the most common things that we see for tuning is students not adding the resonance pinky on their E flat. They're in the staff E flat and half hold G. So make sure that you check a fingering chart and you make sure that that resonance pinky is added to help with tuning on those notes. Now, when it comes to half holding on the bassoon, we've added some information here that you can see on the slide that might be more appropriate for some of your more advanced players. Not all half holds are created equally. So make sure that you know how much they should be covering or uncovering the hole for the best sound and best tuning on the bassoon. All right, clarinet and bass clarinet, everybody's favorite, am I right? Some of the things that you can say quickly that Katie and I use all the time in our rehearsals to address tone quality issues with your clarinets is to click in or anchor in. Make sure that their teeth are on top of the mouthpiece, and by using that phrase, click in, anchor, that helps them to quickly check that embouchure. Corners in, again, with all of these instruments, corners in, like they're saying Q, so that those corners are gripping the mouthpiece and keeping their voicing really high. Clarinet is one of the only instruments that the voicing never changes. Their tongue should be high in an E shape all the time. These are things that you can say quickly to remind your clarinet players if you feel like their tone qualities are a little bit flabby. Now, on bass clarinet, the setup of the bass clarinet, it is super common for us to see people play bass clarinet where the mouthpiece comes straight into their mouth. You need to adjust. Your bass clarinetists need to adjust. They might need to put the bass clarinet at an angle so that they can produce the most characteristic tone quality. The largest tuning considerations on clarinet are obviously the throat tones. We have lots of different suggestions for alternative fingerings. The easiest thing you can do is add the right hand. If you add the right hand to G, G sharp, A, and B flat, that's going to help adjust for some of those tuning things. And then technique, left C. That is not very well known by a lot of people, and it is an alternate fingering in the left pinky that you need to be aware of so you can alert your students when they need to use it. There's also multiple E-flat fingerings, just like all of the woodwind instruments. You need to be aware of the 3 E-flat fingerings, which we've provided for you in the resources, and when it's appropriate to use each of them. Now, the last thing on clarinet and bass clarinet is, remember, we don't want to flip-flop fingers. So when they're going between B-flat and B natural, they need to be using the forte or chromatic fingering on that. Same with F to F sharp up at the top. We want to make sure that we are avoiding any flipping action. All right, now saxophone. Again, very similar to some of the other things we've talked about. You want to make sure if you're experiencing some tone quality issues in your saxophone section that you are checking their setup, the angle of the mouthpiece as it's coming into the mouth. Quite often, we'll see young players that have their elbow pulled all the way up, and they just need to take that right hand, push the saxophone forward so that the angle is more appropriate.
The instrument comes to you.
Always, 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 always. Now, for tenor sax and bari sax players, bari sax especially, I strongly encourage that you have your students get a harness instead of a neck strap. It's way more comfortable. It distributes the weight and helps them to hold it correctly so that they get that correct angle. Like all of the other instruments, you've heard us say corners in, drawstring embouchure. That you must have that in order to have a characteristic saxophone sound.
A round, dark sound.
Absolutely. Now, the most out of tune notes on saxophone that you'll encounter most frequently are C sharp and their concert Fs or that octave D. We see that all the time. Make sure that you're aware of the covered C sharp fingerings. There are some variations of that, and it's good to go kid by kid to see what works best on their instrument. And then anytime you have a sustained octave D on any of the saxophones, you can add the low B pinky key, and it helps to bring that pitch down. Now, just like with clarinet, we want to make sure that our saxophone players are not flipping between F and F sharp, that they are using the chromatic fingering there. And then, as for all of our woodwind instruments, we have a note that there are 3 fingerings for saxophone, it's B flat. Now, make sure you know when to use bis B flat, side key B flat, and 1 and 4 B flat. And in our handout, we've provided some guidance for you on that.
The next instrument is the trumpet, and I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about all brass instruments on this slide since we're getting into those. One thing you can remember on brass is that voicing is critical. Each brass instrument has a little bit of different voicings, which we've provided in this handout and in our resources, but it's important to know when to use different voicings with your students and when to point that out when you're in rehearsal. So you can easily just say, check your voicing, you should be in the E position, etc. for your brass instruments. As with all the instruments, corners in. And I always say to my trumpets and my other brass instruments, corners in for the win. Because when their corners are in, they're going to be able to play higher notes with more ease. Keep reminding all your brass instruments to keep their teeth apart and the centers of their mouth soft. So that way their buzz can be very free and they're not forcing anything to come out or pinching their sounds. That will help with your tone qualities very quickly. With tuning, it's very important to make sure that, first of all tuning slides are well maintained on all brass instruments, because that's really important. How many times have we been in a rehearsal and a kid can't pull out their tuning slide when they're out of tune? And that's just because they haven't maintained their instrument. So that's critical for all the brass instruments. For trumpet in particular, you also want to make sure you know when to use the thumb valve slide. That's for like fourth position notes like E and A. When to use the third valve slide, that's for D and C sharp. And then also knowing when higher notes can be flat or sharp. And we go into more information about that in our resources. If you want to, consider teaching full band positions instead of 1 and 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 3, because sometimes that's quicker and easier if you have a short rehearsal. So that's just a consideration for your brass instruments. With the horn, something really important is to pay attention to hand position. This is something you're going to have to get off the podium and go around and check, or encourage your colleagues to help you with that. You need to make sure that your students are checking their hand position every day, because that affects tuning and tone and everything when they play. I go into much more detail in the resources. Make sure also that your horn players are articulating further down on their teeth, more towards the bottom of their front teeth. That helps for clarity of articulation in a full band setting. And again, check the voicings when they're having trouble sounding or getting their higher partials. Use the Harmony Director. That is a huge resource for you and for your students, because you want to make sure that you know what their part sounds like and you can effectively play it for them if you're not 100% sure on what their part sounds like. They're kind of the hardest instrument, I think, sometimes to hear their pitches. So that's an important resource. Again, make sure you're checking tuning slides. That's incredibly important on horn. And if your horns are on a double horn, make sure you're tuning and checking slides on the front and the back. Tons of alternate fingerings on horn, so make sure you check out our resources for more of those as well.
All right, trombone. Now, like all of the brass instruments, if you're having tonal issues with your trombone, you want to make sure that you're checking their embouchure, that their corners are in, their teeth is apart. We're always listening for that correct voicing, and that they are using a lot of air. As they are increasing their range and going higher and higher, one of the things I say to my brass players all the time is more lip in the cup, more lip in the cup. They sometimes think they have to pull those corners back, and that's not going to work when they're trying to play higher. So more lip in the cup is something you can say quickly from the podium to help remind them about their embouchure. Now, tuning. Trombones are lucky, right? Because they have a tuning slide in their hand the whole time. Make sure that you are checking their actual tuning slide. Some trombone cases, it has to be pushed all the way in when they pack up their instrument. So they need to be reminded regularly to have that tuning slide pulled out just a little bit. And make sure that you are checking that in your rehearsals. Now, second position versus third position, the bane of existence for trombone players. A quick thing I say to my trombone players for second position reminders is inch of silver. You need to have an inch of silver. Now, that's a guide. Obviously, it will be a little bit different depending on what actual note they're playing, but that's a quick reference for them, and they can look at their instrument and go, oh yeah, okay, inch of silver. Or for third position, am I at the bell? All right, the slide all the way out to the bell. Now, fourth positions, D and G, those are tuning nightmares. It is real important that students practice with a tuner and they develop that muscle memory of knowing where that fourth position needs to land. Now, for technique for trombones, their slides need to be as fast as possible. They need to maintain their slide regularly, and I would encourage you to check that in your class.
If you can hear the slide, it's a big problem, and my kids know that's an issue.
Absolutely. We love to tell our trombone players, move the slide as late as possible and as fast as possible. That is going to help with any technique issues they have.
We decided to put euphonium and tuba together because they're pretty similar with just a few different issues. For both instruments, like all the brass, corners in for higher notes, that will help. Voicing on tuba, 95% of the time is going to be the word O. So keep that in mind. That is different than the other brass instruments. And embouchure on tuba, you need to think more like you have a huge egg inside of your mouth. Saying that quickly to tuba players, if they're sharp and pinched, is a lifesaver because it will quickly open up their sounds to make your band sound like $1,000,000. Articulation is also very critical for these low brass instruments, particularly for tuba. And students like to tongue too high inside their mouth. So a quick thing you can remind them is to tongue lower on the front teeth and to at least feel the enamel. If they can feel their front teeth, then they're probably tonguing pretty close to where they should be. And those bells are big and they amplify that clarity of articulation. So that's an important one to say. Keep teaching them to check their tuning slides, to pull outs, particularly their main tuning slides. And of course, they've got to take care of both their home and their school tubas if they're fortunate enough to have an instrument in both places. And that's important because sometimes they don't take care of the one at home. So keep working with your kids to do that. High C is an out of tune note on both of these instruments. It's flat and you can teach students to lip it up. Keep watching their hand position, particularly on the euphonium. Lots of kids like to play with flat fingers, and that hurts their technique as music gets more advanced. So keep working with them on that.
Now, if you have a euphonium player, a young euphonium player that is struggling, if you play on 4-valve euphoniums and they're struggling with their pinky, it is totally appropriate for you to have them bring their left index finger up to play that 4th valve. It would be the same thing if they're on a compensating instrument. So that is a great way if you have a student that has a particularly weak pinky.
Keep encouraging your students to use the same energy down as up when they push their valves. How many times do they push down and then they slowly come back up? So that's a really helpful hint that you can say quickly on the podium as well.
Now for percussion. It's often that I see directors that are just terrified to even work with their percussion sections. But if you don't have a percussion director or percussion specialist on your campus, you need to be just as familiar with the percussion instruments and what they should be doing and how you want the instrument to sound as you are with the wind players. There are three quick things that you can look for. Number one, where they are striking the instrument. I don't care what instrument it is, whether it's a timpani, bass drum, snare drum, or whether it's a melodic instrument, or even a woodblock or tambourine. So check where they are striking the instrument. We go into a lot more detail into our resource, in our resource drive with videos on each of the specific instruments. So make sure you check that out. But strike zone is huge. The implement that they use to play the instrument, that can totally change the color and tone quality of the instrument. So sometimes you might think, no, I don't want a student on marimba, but it might just be the mallet choice that they're using. You might just want a different sound. So make sure that you are comfortable with all the different variations of implements and know what sound they produce so you can communicate to the students what you want to hear. And then finally, rolling on all of the instruments. So know when it's an instrument that it should be a single stroke roll and when it should be a multiple bounce roll. And again, we go into a lot of detail in all of our videos.
We want to encourage you to keep broadening your path. As a young teacher, your path is very narrow, and as a seasoned teacher, every single year your path widens. And we hope that today was helpful for you. Keep widening your path by asking others for help, whether it's a trusted friend, a mentor, a colleague, your private lesson staff. Keep attending clinics and going to conventions so you can learn more about each instrument along your path. And of course, you can always reach out to us.
Thank you to everyone who has helped to influence Katie and I over the course of our careers. Obviously, great teachers are master thieves and steal from everyone. So we want to encourage you to do that. Here is a list of some of the most important people that has helped to influence Katie and I.
We want to be here to help be your path pavers. So if you need anything, especially considering this was a shortened version of our full clinic and full session, please reach out to us through email, or if you have our numbers, you can text us. We want to draw your attention to the QR code in the corner as well, because if you scan that, you're going to have a whole lot of resources that will help you, and we go way more into depth about everything we presented to you today. Thank you so much for having us, TBA, and good luck this year with widening and making your path even better.